series of people where when you start talking to them, within 2 or 3 sentences, you realize there's something strange with their thinking. They're not thinking normally. They're not communicating normally. On the most fundamental level, that's what the disease is. Okay, obviously far more precise than that. Schizophrenia, disease of thought disorder, disease of inappropriate emotion, disease of inappropriate attribution of things, and what you'll see is this is not just some sort of generic craziness in the way that that word means nothing whatsoever. There are typical structures to the ways in which things are not working right in the behavior of schizophrenics.
Schizophrenia has been in existence for many years, even going back to ancient Egypt, in which 1550 BC there has been recordings of schizophrenic behavior. In 1887, a German psychiatrist named Emil Kraepelin was the first person known at this time to give recognition to schizophrenia as its own mental disease. This also brings in our first historical triumph associating with this event, seeing as people will continue Emil's work of identifying as well as researching schizophrenia in later years. In 1911, in Switzerland, the psychiatrist known as Eugene Bleuler came up with a name to go with the mental illness. He received inspiration from its Greek roots, which can be translated to split mind. Later on in his career, he started sorting schizophrenia into different categories. This gave off a triumph of history, for since people began to gain a wider knowledge towards the developments of schizophrenia. While schizophrenia was receiving many triumphs so far, things weren't always quite so easy for everyone. In the early 19th century, delusional treatments were beginning to be performed on those with mental illnesses. For example, some patients were being pumped with oil and sulfur in order to raise their temperature, believing it will burn the disease out of them. It was a desperate attempt to try and treat the disease. All patients would suffer through this tragedy, despite their diverse mental illnesses. While the treatment in mental hospitals could have been way more humane and less barbaric, good news finally arrived for diseases like schizophrenia, which can be described as a psychotic disease. In the 1950s, early antipsychotics were created. Chlorpromazine was the first kind to be made. As of today, people still use chlorpromazine to control their schizophrenia, seeing as no other antipsychotic is stronger than the drug itself. There is clozapine, which is another powerful drug, only to be used if 2 previous and entirely different antipsychotics have been used, but with no effect or progress being done in a long period of time. Chlorpromazine can be used to treat mania, aggressive behavior. It can also be used to treat hiccuping, stomach issues, before surgery, and for tetanus. Clozapine is majorly used to lessen the probability of hallucinations and suicidal urges or tendencies. Both of these medications attempt to restore the natural balance of neurotransmitters in the brain. Both medications also can be used in modern times. This is a huge progress for not only those with schizophrenia, but other psychotic disorders out there. Example, dementia, bipolar disorder, multiple personality syndrome, and etc. In the late 1800s, prefrontal lobotomy therapy was used. It included the practice of injecting a rod into a patient's eye socket in order to cut off a lobe of the brain. Doctors believed if they remove that piece of the brain, then the mental disorder will disappear as well. However, most patients died in the following days after surgery, and one committed suicide. During 1933, a Polish neuropsychologist and psychiatrist named Manfred Sickel presented his first written work over insulin shock therapy for those with schizophrenia. In the performance of this sort of treatment, patients are dosed with an excessive amount of insulin until they are in a coma state. It also lowers the amount of sugar in their blood. They remain in a comatose state for an hour, whilst being injected with a warm salt solution through a stomach tube, or just plain out being injected with glucose. In 1987, Dr. Thomas Hassas published his book called Insanity, The Idea and Its Consequences. In the book, Hassas writes, "If I say that mental illness is a metaphorical illness, I am not saying that it is some other kind of illness. I am saying that it is not an illness at all." Page 151. His book released how much he believed that mental illnesses are just an exaggeration of the mind, and somewhat akin to teenagers going through puberty and hormone imbalances. Sadly, Thomas Hassas wasn't the only one to believe this. Dozens upon dozens of people in society believe that mental illnesses don't really exist and are just a figment of the mind's imagination. Others believe that it's just made up for attention. In 1934, von Madonna began convulsive therapy for those who had epilepsy and schizophrenia. He began with injecting camphor into patients' muscles to see if there would be any results. In modern times, camphor can be used for healing burns and for fix balm. Von Madonna later used pentyleneditetrazole, seeing it was more effective than camphor. Pentyleneditetrazole is a drug used for circulatory and respiratory medication. Von Madonna also performed the carbon dioxide therapy, forcing patients to intake a mixture of 30% carbon dioxide and 70% oxygen until patients pass out. In 1938, von Madonna began to perform electroconvulsive therapy with a greater chance of success. Electroconvulsive therapy is used by injecting electricity directly into patients' brains. It was more of a triumph than a tragedy for people with schizophrenia. Developing more into the twisted side of humanity's treatment of mental health, the first mental hospital in America was opened in 1753 in Philadelphia. One of the most earliest treatments was bloodletting, a type of treatment in which they dream an extreme amount of blood, yet not fatal, from patients. The psychiatrists from the past believed it was working, since the patients were quote-unquote calming down. They were unaware of a sign of blood loss. Too much blood loss from the human body can make one experience dizziness, delusions, and disorganization. Amongst that, they also used morphine and cold baths to treat them. Quite contrary to the popular belief, doctors were trying their best in the early mental hospitals to treat their patients. Morphine and cold baths were one of the most soothing techniques they have discovered so far in that time period, so they tried to release most patients' stress that way. As time passed by, so did more people being admitted into institutions. The more patients meant a higher budget. In most mental health institutions, the price was too high, and this is when the neglect, abuse, and wars began. In 1820, hundreds of people were being sent to asylums. Because of the low fundings, nobody could treat them. They were just there to be something akin to a guest in a house of strangers. In 1841, Dorothea Dix toured many institutions and began writing to state legislators. One of her cases got approved for funding in a mental institution in Massachusetts. In 1908 or 1909, Clifford Beers began to take control over his part in the mental health hygiene movement. Instead of touring mental hospitals across the states, he actually got treated on one. Disturbed by his stay in an institution called Connecticut State Hospital, he decided to go out and publish a book that fueled the importance of the movement. The book goes on to describe his stay, saying that he, along with the other patients, were abused physically, verbally, and mentally. He talked about how the patients were only supposed to be there as a cash grab for the supposed doctors. Later on in Clifford Beers' life, he became the founder of Mental Health America. He also advertised the importance of mental health awareness in the United States. His attempts were not in vain, seeing as the centuries that followed went on to continue his work, winning him multiple awards. Nowadays, there are 21 medications used to treat schizophrenia, and there's more knowledge in the leading of schizophrenia. After so many tragedies associated with schizophrenia, like not enough of an understanding with the disease, cruel and dehumanizing methods of treatment, it's refreshing to see the good associated with it, like the mental health hygiene movement, the usefulness of some drugs, and the effectiveness of newer treatments. It was important that we learn from our mistakes in history, like in schizophrenia. We as humans need to learn of our mistakes. Such examples of mistakes are such like treatments of schizophrenia, like lobotomy, which we learned to never repeat again. The triumphs of schizophrenia, like electroconvulsive therapy and the effectiveness of clopramazine, lets future psychiatrists know what works for treatments and how they can fix it and evolve them to completely cure schizophrenia. Thank you for watching the history of schizophrenia.